Mazu, famously, she's not very good at English. It's much better if you do it in Taiwanese. And maybe Shim's story is about that and how, the gods don't necessarily speak Mandarin that well either.
Yeah.
But I feel like she picked up Gaelic incredibly quickly.
Everyone, and welcome to Tales of Our Times. This is a show where we discuss the stories that move us, what makes them so meaningful, and why others could or should find meaning in them as well. Today we have another special interview with Will Buckingham and the work he recently co-edited in 4 languages, including 2 smaller languages, one of which you've heard of, Tâi-gí, and another one, Gaelic from Scotland. I hope that you'll enjoy this interview as much as I did, and I'll see you next week. All right, and so welcome to the studio, Will Buckingham.
Hello there, it's an absolute pleasure to be here in Taipei.
So is there anything that you would like to say to introduce yourself first before we get into your work and your contribution?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Will Buckingham. I'm a writer from the UK. And also an editor and a philosopher and a teacher. I also teach philosophy and creative writing. And currently I'm based down in Tainan.
Wow.
And I co-direct a small publishing company called Wind and Bones along with fellow writer Hannah Stevens.
And so we're going to be getting into one of your most recent publications there, done at Wind and Bones. But I don't think we've ever actually been able to sit down with somebody who has played the role of an editor. Could you describe your role during the publishing process? What happens during that process of creating a book?
I think editing is an incredibly pleasurable thing to be doing, to be working with writers, to really take their work and work together with them to shape it into the very best possible work it can be. In a way, the editor is a person who sits between you and your audience. It's like a proxy audience before you actually have the work out there, who's thinking about how this will read, thinking about what do you really want to say as a writer, and helping you bring that into focus.
Yeah.
Because I know as a writer that's not always clear.
Or sometimes it's clear to you, but you have such a strong vision in your head that it hasn't made it out onto the page. Like you feel like you've explained it clearly enough, and it's really just not coming across.
Yeah, all the time. And it happens all the time to me as a writer.
Yes.
And so I think the art of editing is to help writers make those things explicit.
I love that wording of the bridge between the audience and the writer, right? To try and help these two people meet together on the work.
Yeah.
And let's get into the work. So we're here today to talk about this book that you co-edited for your publishing house, Tâigael, Stories from Taiwanese and Gaelic, which I just learned before this. If you are an American audience like me, it is Gaelic, not Gaelic, because we're talking about Scottish stories.
We are, yes.
Not Irish stories.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know, before we kind of get into discussing a little bit more about the minutiae, could you give the listeners an introduction to what they could expect from Tâigael, Stories from Taiwanese and Gaelic? What does that mean?
So the book is a collection of original fiction. We commissioned new stories from 4 writers, 2 in Scotland, 2 in Taiwan, all women writers. All of them write in their own mother tongues or write in minoritized languages. Our Scottish writers in Gaelic and our Taiwanese writers in Tâi-gí. And the book is an exercise not just in writing new and exciting fiction in these minoritized languages, but also in translation. So we worked together with the writers very closely. We got some funding from the Scottish Government, from the Scottish Connections Fund, and we got the writers together to talk about the kind of stories they're interested in, talk about the complexities of writing in smaller languages, like Tâi-gí and Gaelic. And then we worked collaboratively as a team to translate those stories. So the Tâi-gí stories were translated into Mandarin and into English. And those English versions were translated into Gaelic. And then our Gaelic stories were translated by the writers into English. We commissioned our friend Sheng Qishu to translate those into Mandarin. And then our Taiwanese Tâi-gí writers translated those stories into Tâi-gí. So each story is in 4 languages.
Yes.
And we have 4 writers. So 4 languages, 4 stories, 4 writers.
So that immediately tees up the next question I wanted to ask you. This struck me immediately as a very ambitious project. And I think you've just illustrated that beautifully as to like how many steps were involved for each of these stories. What inspired this project? Because it is very involved.
So shortly after we'd arrived in Taiwan, so myself and Hannah, who's the other co-editor, we were at a conference on minoritized languages in 2024. And so there was a lot of presentations about Tâi-gí, about Hakka, about indigenous languages in Taiwan. Yes. But there were also some delegates from the UK talking about Gaelic and Welsh and Scots. And we started thinking, because of that, we got into lots of conversations about those similarities between the experiences of historically of Gaelic speakers in Scotland and of Tâi-gí speakers here.
Yeah.
And we thought, how about we bring these 2 things together? We're both Hannah and I are English, but we're new immigrants to Scotland, so we consider ourselves new Scots. Wyndham Bones is based in Scotland as a company, but now we're living in Taiwan, so we're sort of double immigrants. In places where there's a language diversity which
feels familiar, perhaps, on some levels.
Familiar, perhaps, between Taiwan and Scotland, but also is perhaps not that familiar to our fellow English people down in England.
Right.
So we were just really excited by those connections. And then we saw this small fund from the Scottish Government. And initially it was going to be a small pilot project. But Hannah and I have a terrible habit of letting things
like
get
building
out of hand.
on.
And in January this year, only January, we thought this should be a book.
Wow, really?
Yes, so
that's fascinating.
We had the stories coming in the initial draft, and the stories were wonderful. So from Naomi Shim and Kyu Kong here in Taiwan, and Melissa Hunter-Dorrans and Lisa MacDonald in Scotland, and they were such wonderful stories. We thought this needs to be a book, and it's sort of built from there. So. We can talk maybe about the challenges of proofreading a piece like this and copy editing in a bit. But that's
I will
what we
try to get to that.
Found ourselves committing ourselves to in January. And it's been a incredibly hectic 5 or 6 months since then.
Definitely. Well, I want to circle back to something that I find very interesting. And this is going to be a little bit of a journey. So I apologize in advance for this one. But something that you pointed out is like the interesting linguistic differences between... Not differences. What am I talking about? The opposite. The interesting linguistic similarities between Gaelic and Tâi-gí in terms of like their history and having been a language that was once oppressed and is now experiencing a revival, if we count this currently as a revival, right? Something else, though, that I find very interesting to study is also the ways in which folklore and other stories in fiction from around the world sort of mirrors itself. And so earlier this year, we had the pleasure of speaking to another editor and another writer who we discussed the similarities between stories of little people from indigenous cultures here in Taiwan and also from the British Isles, and how there are strange similarities that you may not expect. Of course, you said these are like original works of fiction from each. But I was curious if you found any similarity in terms of patterns or motifs in the stories that you read from these authors in very different places around the world, but with perhaps shared history that is not immediately evident, even if we just look at like the language.
I think the first thing that comes to mind is that both Gaelic and Tâi-gí have been very sort of strongly oral traditions. There is a written literary tradition in Tâi-gí. The Gaelic written literary tradition is longer. But both of them have a very strong oral kind of component. And I think one thing that goes along with that, maybe, is the presence of grandmothers. Because who's the storyteller if it's not the grandmother?
It has to be the wise old person in your family. The one she's seen it all, she's been there, she knows it.
Yeah, totally. So in at least 3 of the stories, we have grandmothers or grandmother-like figures who appear 3 out of 4 of the stories. And I feel like there's a natural kinship between the fierce grandmother in Scotland at the Hogmanay party and the grandmother uttering prophecies by the U-bike stand in Kyukyong's story, and the ama who's speeding around with her granddaughter and the scooter in Naomi Shim's story.
Yeah.
So that's one theme. And we were interested by the way we didn't sort of set an agenda for the stories.
Yes.
We said to the writers, this is us, this is what we're doing, write a story, whatever you like. And we were surprised by the feelings of cross-currents between the stories. Sometimes they were more thematic, like underlying questions of the possibility and threat of violence, which were there strongly in some stories, but also, I think, a sense of mood and feel.
Yeah, kind of those things that are like, I won't say they're impossible to tell someone to do, but it's very hard to give someone that instruction and see it play out naturally. It's something that often kind of feels like it works its own way out of a piece.
Yeah, and I think particularly those connections, and because these are oral traditions, that our language is where the oral traditions are much stronger. So, for example, the story about Mazu, the sea goddess. Mazu, famously, she's not very good at English.
No.
You go to the temple and you ask Mazu, and it's much better if you do it in Taiwanese. And Naomi Shim's story is about that and how, the gods don't necessarily speak Mandarin that well either. So we should stick to Tâi-gí.
Yeah.
And I think that's, Mazu probably doesn't speak English very well, but I feel like she picked up Gaelic incredibly quickly. She felt very natural in Gaelic.
Yeah.
I don't quite know what I mean by that, but I feel like there's a sense of
it's just that
sort of shared world, shared kind of world of feeling between the Tâi-gí stories and the context of Tâi-gí stories and the Gaelic stories.
Well, actually, that gets to another question that I wanted to ask you. Something that I find really interesting whenever we get around to this topic of like stories coming from one specific culture and stories that are like rooted in that culture, including in the language of that culture, is just this thing you're talking about now. Like there's this sort of like feeling that comes along with it. So what importance do you think that there is in having these stories published in people's original or mother tongue?
Yeah, it's a really good question. One thing I think is that in that translation process, there's a sense of broadening the possibilities of expression within that language. We've worked before in Bulgaria, and Gàidhlig, one of our Bulgarian writer friends, has talked very interestingly about the challenges of writing in a small language. And I think another Bulgarian writer, Nadia Radlova, has talked about how she tries to find more elbow room within that language.
Yeah.
And I think, in a way, that translation process, we saw that as opening out new possibilities. And writers are doing this all the time, of course. We're not unique in this. But in translating something from a Scottish Gaelic context into Taiwanese, we're playing with what it's possible to say and how it's possible to bring those contexts into the Taiwanese language. And the same with Taiwanese
from Taiwanese into Gaelic.
We can kind of do mother tongue smaller languages a disservice by thinking Taiwanese has to speak about
only Taiwanese subjects.
Gaelic has to speak about being in Scotland. And for some writers in those languages, I know that that's a frustration.
Right.
What if I want to write in Taiwanese and write science fiction, as one of our writers is
exactly.
doing?
Yes.
Write about
why can't I write
cruises and outer space.
I was gonna say, why can't I write a high fantasy thing? Or like, why would I have to write a high fantasy thing? Like, I don't know. Like,
one of the things we saw ourselves doing is finding a bit more elbow room by translating across those contexts.
So, okay. Then let's get back to the actual process of making the book. And let's get to this thing we've alluded to several times, the challenges. So 4 languages, but 5 versions, because Tâi-gí was written in 2 different ways. Yeah. What were the unique, I was going to ask, were there any unique challenges? I'm going to toss that and just say, what were the unique challenges that came up while you were working with 4 stories and 5 ways to transcribe those languages?
I suppose the starting challenges were simply just challenges of translation. The question of how you translate not just the words, but also the context. A very simple example we've used quite a lot is, there's a temple, outside the temple there's a tree. And everyone in Taiwan knows this is a banyan tree. as a reader in Scotland, you might be imagining a pine tree. Mm-hmm. You might be imagining something very, very different. How much of that context do you want to bring across? So there were those translation challenges which we worked with the writers very, very closely, and they worked with each other very closely. There were challenges. So Alyssa Hunter-Dorrance's story has a personified character who is the Free Church of Scotland. I mean, however Q-Kong did that in Taiwanese, it's a triumph.
Yeah.
But also Q-Kong and Shengji made different choices in how they translated that.
Yes.
And I love that difference. But also just the sheer difficulty of putting together a book in 4 stories and 5 versions. So that's 20 stories. And then you have to imagine that in those 20 stories, if suddenly one of our Gaelic writers says, oh, this doesn't work. I know Lisa MacDonald was wrestling because Gaelic grammar is precise in ways English grammar
is not.
Yeah. And in ways that Taiwanese grammar is not.
Yeah.
So Lisa was... I think she lost years of her life
trying to figure out how to get it. Yes.
But also when a change happened over there,
you have to change every other version.
It rippled back through all the versions. So we have this, I think most of my hard drive is just this folder of
versions,
alternate drafts.
Yes.
And we have. So it was a
real labor of love, it sounds like.
Love.
Yeah. I'm sure that now seeing the end product together must be so gratifying.
Yeah, we were just delighted to be able to see it out there and in a way not have to read it anymore.
Yeah.
That's up to other people.
Yes.
Now. It's not us.
All right, so we're almost out of time, but before we wrap up, perhaps this is an impossible question. I want to ask you, out of the 4 stories, do you have one of them that is a favorite of yours? Or if you don't want to use the word favorite, then perhaps one of the stories that resonated with you more than the others?
That's a really interesting question. I think for me, because I translated the Taiwanese stories from Taiwanese into English, so those went straight from Taiwanese to English rather than through Mandarin.
Yeah.
And I learnt a lot through that. And so I think for me, I love all the stories. I love the delicacy of Lisa's story and the wild inventiveness of Alyssa's. But the 2 Taiwanese stories, because I was so deeply involved in those, I think for me, they sort of speak more strongly because of that level of involvement. So my background is also in anthropology, and so I have a particular interest in Taiwanese religion. So I loved Naomi's evocation of the grandmother and Mazu and this strange temple goings-on that were happening in her story. The narrator wakes up with a lump in her mouth. She's going to go to the doctor, but her grandmother says, no, you don't need the doctor. Who do you need? You need Mazu.
You need Matsu,
So they go down to the temple and all of this mayhem unfolds there.
Yeah.
And I love that story for its sense of mischief. And so that was a delight to translate. And also Q-Kyong's story, I thought, was a beautiful evocation of a kind of sense of alienation and desire for connection. And a world where things don't quite meet up. And it ends in this terrible act. But it's written with considerable delicacy and grace. And that was a lot of fun to translate as well.
What a challenge it must have been. Well, thank you for your time. This has been a really fun discussion for me. I've loved learning more about this. Where could people find these books if they want to read them?
Great. So you can buy the book direct from us, books.windandbones.com. There's also audio. So Creative Scotland gave us a grant for the audio.
Oh, yes.
So you can listen to all the stories for free on Taigael.com. It's also available from global distributors and stockists. It's published in the UK, so distribution here is being a little bit slower. But if you want to get your hands on it really quickly, come to books.windandbones.com and you can have the book in your hands in 24 hours.
Excellent. Well, and I think this is one of those few books where I could say, I feel like there's very little excuse not to read it because, as we've said, it is in 4 languages and it is transcribed in 5 different ways. So you can pick how you would like to engage with these stories. It's 4 wonderfully creative short stories. But thank you so much for coming in and talking with us, Will Buckingham, the co-editor of Tâigael And thank you to all you listeners out there. This has been Tales of Our Time on Radio Taiwan International. I was your host, Amanda Stevens. And today, as I said, we were talking about Tâigael, stories from Taiwanese and Gaelic, a tale of our time. And we'll see you next time.